Okay then, so I'm sure lots of you have seen the Kubler-Ross grief cycle peddled all over the place for different topics. But I just thought it was useful just to reflect on the sort of journey that we've all been on since March 23rd, when life as we know it came to a halt. So we started off when lockdown hit, feeling quite, I suppose, confused, a little bit scared, wondering what's going to happen for the future. And I think some people sort of pushed back a little bit and tried to carry on doing things they'd always done. And obviously it failed because everywhere closed. It was very difficult to do anything quickly or easily. I think then we became a little bit irritated as things carried on. We started to feel frustrated. We couldn't go out. We couldn't see people. We worried about how our friends were, how our relatives were. And then we sort of found ways of carrying on. They weren't necessarily fun ways. It was a bit like Groundhog Day, but we carried on. And I think for a lot of people, their mood started to dip a little bit. They became a little anxious, overwhelmed, perhaps lost their mojo a little bit, their motivation. And then people started to find new ways of creating meaning in their lives. So lots of people volunteered for the NHS, people looked out for their neighbours and friends and started things like apps for their neighbours. So I think we all struggled to find new meaning, to find new ways of finding satisfaction in our lives. And we sort of got used to lockdown to the point where I think a lot of people found they actually enjoyed it. And I think some recent research suggested that only 9% of people want life to go back to how it was prior to lockdown, which is interesting in itself. So you could argue we're now at sort of an acceptance level where we're moving forward into a new world, whatever that turns out to be. And I think we've gone through the whole range of emotions as we move from lockdown to business as unusual to the point we're at now. And I think the thing that really merits attention is how we're feeling now. And I think a lot of the emotions that we've had from the outset are still there. A lot of people are still frightened of COVID, and you could argue, yes, they should be. There's quite a lot of concern over having to go back to places of work, mingle with people again, worries about transport, and I'll show you some figures about people's levels of anxieties around that. Many people have people at home who are vulnerable, who need to be protected to some degree, and they're frightened of catching something during their working lives and taking it back home. And I think it's probably fair to say that for a percentage of people, going into lockdown and everything that's happened has actually changed their perspective, as I said, to the point where they don't want life to go back to normal. Maybe they don't want to go back to work. Maybe they don't want to even carry on with the jobs they're doing. Maybe this has really made them reflect on where they are, what makes them happy in their lives, and what they might want to do from here onwards. So if we look at what some of the research is saying, if we start off first of all with the sort of the pan-European research, and it's probably fair to say that, as you can imagine, at the moment we don't have a massive amount of research. But what I've done is I've tried to pull together the research from quality sources. So at least, although there's not a massive amount of research, we can have a degree of confidence in what the research we have is actually saying. So I guess the first one from the European Quality of Life Survey, mental well-being has actually reduced since 2016. And I think perhaps a little bit more worrying, only 45% of people now feel optimistic about their future. So less than half the population of Europe feel optimistic about their future, with less than 36% optimistic about their children's future or that of their grandchildren's. Loneliness has increased. We don't have any accurate figures for that, but I guess that would be absolutely no surprise to anyone. 40% of people are pessimistic about their financial situation. Once again, no great surprises there. 50% of households already unable to make ends meet. And the latest economic research for Europe and the UK is saying that we're now entering into even worse times. So that 50% of households not making ends meet could increase even further. And 20% of people are fearful of losing their homes. And if we look at the impact of self-isolating, now some of this research in the next two slides is taken from countries who are ahead of us on the curve, because what they've already been through, we're about to face. So it's worth looking at what they've found. And I guess the first thing is the research shows that adults in locations more affected by the virus experienced lower physical and mental health. Once again, no great surprises there. Adults with existing health conditions, both mental and physical, were at increased risk of lowered mental health during the lockdown. Adults who had actually stopped working during lockdown were at higher risk of harm to their mental health. And the World Health Organization has suggested that the main psychological impact of COVID has been increased rates of stress and anxiety, but also high levels of loneliness, depression, harmful alcohol and drug use, and self-harm and suicidal behavior. And these figures are all expected to rise as time progresses. Some research by Tweng and Joyner in the US, both very respected researchers, found that people in the US are 8 times more likely to meet the criteria for moderate to serious mental illness than they were in 2018. And the impact of self-isolation with regard to work, interestingly, some figures from Greece show that just 1 month of confinement can negatively impact physical and mental health, and we had almost 3 months of lockdown here. A survey from Italy has found that 80% of people needed support to cope with the impacts of coronavirus. So this was as lockdown eased, 80% of people needed psychological support. There have been suicides related directly to COVID-19, according to research from Italy. Obviously, the figures at the moment are still emerging, but it seems that the suicides that did occur in relation to COVID were about finances, or lack of finances, I suppose. And interestingly, as they opened up lockdown in Italy, although people were free to move around as they wished, a large number of people chose not to go out and remain in self-isolation due to fear. Interestingly, the World Health Organization have suggested that coronavirus may never go away, and they say that a global mental health crisis is looming due to the pandemic. And I have to say, this view is also shared by the British Psychological Society, so a number of the clinicians have been speaking out on this also. Some recent research from CIPD found that 44% of UK staff are anxious about returning to work. And a recent study by Mind found that 65% of people over 25 and 75% of young people with existing mental health problems reported that their mental health has worsened. So what we're looking at here is a real increase in mental health issues for average people as a result of COVID, and not just lockdown. This is something that is going forward, something that is not going to go away. There's also been some research from people who experienced COVID, people who were serious enough to be hospitalized through it. And of the people who were hospitalized through COVID, a percentage experienced no longer-term psychological impact at all. Some people actually experienced an increase in their mental health because they actually felt grateful that they had recovered from COVID when other people hadn't. So they felt, I suppose, able to share their experience, and their mood was actually higher. However, for a percentage of people, they actually experienced reduced mental health. after they'd recovered from COVID. So for a percentage of people, they had higher levels of anxiety and lower mood, a sort of a hypervigilance to bodily symptoms, as though they were frightened that either they may catch COVID again, because there's been no definitive research yet that says you can't re-catch COVID. These people also experience flashbacks, poor sleep, a bit like traumatic stress disorder, impaired memory function, so difficulties in concentrating, difficulties in making decisions, fear of stigma, so they're frightened of anybody finding out. They're frightened of contaminating others, even though they've recovered from coronavirus. And the clinicians have concluded that these people will need not only ongoing practical support, but ongoing psychological support. So these are all things that organisations need to be aware of. And over above all that, there are some other practical considerations for organisations to bear in mind when trying to get people back to work. The first thing I think that organisations, or some organisations, are going to have to deal with is the fact that once people start returning to work, you will see those empty chairs where colleagues lost to COVID actually sat, and that's going to generate feelings of loss, possibly also survivor syndrome, where people think, well, you know, well, why did young Johnny die age 20 and I'm 62? Why was it him and not me? All these kinds of guilt feelings that people often have. There is potentially going to be mistrust of colleagues. You've probably all seen this yourself when you're in public areas. You see people sort of moving away from you because they're worried, they're anxious. We're in the workplace, we're going to see people mistrustful of colleagues. Have they got symptoms? Have they got people at home with coronavirus? All those kinds of things. We're going to see people coming back to the workplace with grief, people they've lost to COVID, people they've lost with other illnesses. We're going to see possible resentment of home workers. So in those organisations that have had some workers having to work all the way through lockdown, those people may feel resentful seeing people come back after what they see as a 3-month holiday. We're going to see levels of stress and exhaustion potentially in those staff who've had to keep working all the way through lockdown. Also, interestingly, there's some research suggesting that for those people who worked all the way through lockdown, some of them are now saying that they were fine during lockdown because there weren't many people around and they felt safe, whereas now lockdown has been opened and they're coming into contact with a lot more people. They're also coming into contact with people who've had COVID. They're actually feeling a lot more anxious about carrying on their work in these situations. There's also some research that the British Psychological Society are publishing a paper on about the additional stressors associated with taking trauma-related work home. And by trauma-related work, I think what the paper has been looking at is people like NHS people, doctors, radiographers, anybody who has to look at potentially traumatic data at their home, and people like maybe social workers dealing with maybe child abuse cases or something that where there is an emotional element. And what the research is suggesting is that when people did this work in the workplace, when they left the workplace, they were able to leave that behind to some extent, but trying to carry out that kind of work in the workplace, in home, creates all sorts of issues about how they feel about it, whether they actually feel they can get away from it, and maybe concerns about any other family members seeing this sort of traumatic work on the screen accidentally. Oops, sorry. So I guess thinking of all that research, the big question is, I guess, where are we now in terms of organisations, and what are we going to have to do to help people come back to work feeling psychologically safe? And I guess there are a number of things. So the first thing is we're going to have to make sure that people feel they have both physical and psychological safety. We're going to have to make sure that people feel that they have adequate support from their line managers, that their leaders are people focused, that they have support in managing their mental well-being, and maybe they're going to need help to feel connected with colleagues. And some of these factors are not just about people returning physically to work. Some of the factors are also going to be relevant for people who are going to remain as home workers, who were not home workers prior to lockdown. And also we have to bear in mind that a number of people will actually really not want to go back to work, and this is going to increase their vulnerability to mental health issues. Now, within organisations, people sometimes say, well, you know, well-being is down to HR, or it's down to health and safety or occupational health. But the reality is that there are many players within an organisation, and trying to achieve a high level of mental well-being and physical well-being is going to be down to all of us. And I think there are different roles that each organisational stakeholder is going to have to play. But what I want to do as quickly as possible is just go through several of what I think of as the key players, and just talk about what's going to be required from them. So let's start off with managers then. Managers, as we know, are absolute key and pivotal to well-being in organisations. And they're going to, once again, have a key role to play in helping people feel safe in returning to work and maintain their well-being. So the first thing that managers are going to have to do is pay even more attention to their own mental well-being, because if we have managers who are also anxious about COVID themselves and who are perhaps feeling stressed and overwhelmed, they're not going to be in any kind of position to help anyone else. So it is going to be even more important that managers look after their own well-being. The other thing that's going to be crucial, I think at the moment, prior to Saturday, only 4% of organisations had physically returned people to work. Obviously, that figure is now going to be higher. But I think where organisations have not yet returned people to work, they need to ideally open a dialogue now with staff about what do they need to do in order to make staff feel comfortable returning to work. And for those organisations that haven't done that and have just returned people to work, they need to start talking to them now about how they feel. Do they feel safe? And what else managers and the rest of the organisation need to do to enable them to feel safe and comfortable in work. Openness and honesty have always been crucial for managers, but it's more important than ever now, particularly around safety. So, for example, there is absolutely no point in managers promising employees that the office is going to be sanitised every day if it's not physically possible to do it. So I think this really is a time for openness and honesty. Managers are going to, I think, have to work harder at being visible and building trust. Some managers are going to be in a situation where half their staff potentially are physically in work and half of them are working from home. So they're going to have to concentrate on what visibility means to each of those groups and how they bring about that visibility. Trust will have been good in some organisations prior to lockdown. In some organisations it will have been poor. And we know that in some organisations trust has been made poor by lockdown. There have been anecdotal stories of managers ringing staff frequently during lockdown, not to ask how they are or to check on their well-being, but to simply make sure that they're at the desk and working. So you can imagine there are some bridges to be built in many organisations, but even the better ones, I think, are going to have to review again how they engender a feeling of safety and trust. More than ever, people skills are going to come to the fore. Managers are going to have to be empathetic, and they're going to have to encourage staff to talk about how they feel. We know that mental health is going to be more important than ever. We know it's going to be more topical than ever. And there's going to be more of a need for managers to create stigma-free environments where people are encouraged to talk about how they feel. Also, if people are returning to work, they're going to be returning under social distance measures. And that means for some workers, it's going to feel difficult to connect socially. And managers might have to help staff to identify ways in which they can socialize and connect in a safe way, because it may not be as obvious as it was before. Also, as we know from the research, there will be staff who are vulnerable, people who've had mental health conditions in the past, people who are now developing mental health conditions, people who are on the borderline, and it's going to be more important than ever that managers are vigilant about staff, that they're watching out for those early warning signs. Also, it's going to be important that managers keep reminding staff of the support that's available. Now, the bigger companies will have all sorts of packages on offer and intranets offering those services, but managers will still need to remind staff. For smaller organizations that don't have any services available, managers need to find out what's available in the area, what drop-in clinics are there in the NHS, what can you access, what do Mind offer, what do other charities offer that help people with mental health issues, and they're going to make sure they've got something that they can offer to staff. I think flexibility is going to be key to keeping people safe and well, and I think managers are going to have to forget everything that's gone before and learn to work with flexibility and learn to manage flexibility well. And that means they're going to perhaps have to cope with their own feelings of mistrust for some managers. And I think the days of focusing on targets and productivity are gone. I think those managers and organizations that continue to try and focus on targets and productivity will make well-being worse. Whereas those organizations that focus on well-being will see productivity improve naturally. So I think there's a real lesson there for both managers and organizations. So what do leaders need to do then? Well, I think like managers, leaders have a key role to play, and I think there are a number of things that they have to do, some of which echoes what managers need to do, some things that are a little bit different. Now, I think when there is a crisis, any kind of crisis, but particularly the one we're living in now, there's a tendency for senior teams to move to command and control. Now, that isn't necessarily a bad thing, particularly given the fact that there is so little certainty at the moment. And command and control can sometimes be quite helpful for staff in these conditions, because if staff can see a clear direction, it can sometimes be helpful in the short time in terms of helping staff to adapt. However, the problem with command and control decision making is there is no transparency about it generally. And this can lead to suspicion and can lead to mistrust. So I think leaders who have moved to command and control need to just make sure that the rationale behind their decisions is shared so that decision making is as transparent as possible. That way they will actually get some benefits of command and control until they get the chance to let the dust settle and sort things out a little bit. I think it's going to be even more crucial for leaders to have high levels of emotional intelligence and higher levels of interpersonal skills, because they're going to have to concentrate on real engagement and interaction with staff, because they're going to have to tap into staff knowledge to help them rebuild organizations, guide organizations in new directions, and people's skills are going to be absolutely critical to achieving that. And like managers, they're going to have to address their own well-being. They're going to have to make sure that they build their own mental resilience and toughness so that they can continue to focus on what matters from a business perspective, whilst making sure that they're keeping people supported and making the best decisions possible. Once again, they're going to have to concentrate on building trust and stigma-free environments. And that's also going to be necessary to support the managers, to enable the managers to do their best. And I think also those organizations that haven't implemented a strategic approach to well-being are going to have to do that. Because as I said earlier, if they don't get the well-being right, productivity will really suffer. Compassion is going to be important, compassion and empathy. And once again, I think organisations will have to embrace flexibility. They're going to have to run with mixtures of home working, people coming in 2 days a week, people choosing when to come in, and they're going to have to learn to live with that. And I think it has tremendous benefits for organisations, but only for those organisations that make it work, rather than treating it as a grace and favour kind of thing. And then I think there's a role for HR. Sorry, do shut me up if I'm going on too long, David. I think for HR, once again, there are specific things to do, and I think they are going to have to tweak how they've operated in the past. One of the things that seems to be coming out from leaders is that they need HR to work more closely with them, and HR to really understand the strategic direction the organisation is taking, so that they can then help translate that into human resource policies and practices. And I think not only are HR going to have to put emphasis on collaborating more with the top team, they're going to have to work more closely with managers and more closely with health and safety to make sure that safety and psychological safety are emphasised at all levels and across all policies, and also that people management really does come to the forefront. I think also they're going to have to review sickness absence and relevant policies, because I think COVID has thrown most things out of the window. And they're also going to have to review their EAP support and emphasise more preventative wellbeing measures, because if they just rely on the proactive measures, on the reactive measures that organisations have used in the past, they're going to find that those reactive measures are totally overwhelmed, and that they don't have enough productive staff to keep going. And once again, they're going to have to look after their own well-being. I think also there's a different role in some ways for health and safety practitioners, in that they're also going to have to concentrate on preventative well-being, proactive well-being. So I think there's going to be more of a need for them to look at things like well-being audits, to make sure that psychosocial risks are better identified and monitored. I think they're going to have to work more closely with managers and HR to carry on emphasising the increased risk that mental health now poses and the importance of psychosocial risks. And I think there's possibly a role in working with HR to engage staff better in responding to wellbeing audits, so that they can actually identify interventions that staff are going to engage with and make work. There's also going to be a real need to monitor and be vigilant about safety critical roles, drivers, pilots, all those kinds of roles. And also, I guess, a huge role in reassuring staff about both physical and psychological safety. And then I guess finally, there's a role for us as occupational psychologists. Now, I know not many organisations in the scheme of things employ organisational psychologists, but I think there is a role for us all to play. And I think for organisational psychologists, the things that we have to do are around things like designing better audit tools so that organisations can assess wellbeing effectively, helping organisations identify and develop the best wellbeing strategies for them, helping organisations better design work and jobs to maximise wellbeing, coaching and developing leaders to better engage and support their workforce, helping organisations design supportive and productive work cultures, helping organisations manage change processes so that it doesn't cause more mental health issues, create more psychosocial risks. And I guess for some organisational psychologists also, there's probably going to be a role in supporting organisations with things like cognitive assessments to support people for whom COVID has had a real individual impact, and maybe helping struggling individuals manage post-COVID symptoms more effectively. So, sorry if that took longer than anticipated, but that's enough from me. So I'm going to end this now. There we go. And obviously happy to take any comments.